In the small town of Fulton in the U.S. state of Missouri, there is a church on the campus of Westminster College, which is not what it seems. Firstly, other than weddings, there are not any normal church functions done here. Instead, it mostly serves as a museum, more specifically America's national museum dedicated to the World War II era British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill. Furthermore, despite how it looks, this building started as a 12th century medieval church in the city of London. How did a medieval English church end up in a small town in Missouri? It's actually quite an interesting story. Sometime in the mid to late 12th century, St. Mary Aldermanbury was built as a small Catholic church in the city of London on Aldermanbury Street. Yes, to be clear, that original City of London inside but separate from modern Greater London. We don't know the exact original date of the church's construction, but its earliest mention is in 1181. At one point, it became the parish church for the ward of Bassishaw, and while there's no visual depiction of the church during that time period, we do know it was smaller than it is now. Using this modern picture as a reference, we know that these sides were not originally there, and the exterior looked more like the typical Norman-designed churches at the time, which if you compare to other Norman-style churches, you can see the general shape of the roof and tower is still there. Sometime in the 15th century, the bell tower was redone, and then the church went from Catholic to Anglican under King Henry VIII's reign. While we don't know if Shakespeare himself ever attended this church, we do know that two notable actors of his play company did, John Hemmings and Henry Condell. Later in 1656, the poet John Milton got married in this church to his second wife. But then in 1666, the Great Fire of London ravaged the area and destroyed the church. After the fire, notable English architect and mathematician Christopher Wren would spend years on rebuilding 52 London churches lost in the Great Fire, including the famous St. Paul's Cathedral. In 1670, Wren got permission to rebuild St. Mary Aldermanbury. The original church's foundation, crypt, and set of stairs leading to it were well preserved. The rest of the rubble was taken away, and the church was rebuilt starting in 1672. This time, it was expanded to the shape it has today, incorporating a mixture of Renaissance and Baroque architectural styles that Wren was a fan of. Wren was knighted in 1673, and the rebuilt church was complete enough to restart services in 1677, and then fully complete in 1679. The church would, however, find itself destroyed again 243 years later, thanks to the German Blitz over London during World War II. On December 29, 1940, German bombs once again set the church on fire. Only the foundations, a few outer walls, and 7 interior columns remained. Unlike the Great Fire, which just devastated London, the Blitz leveled a lot more of the United Kingdom as a whole. Rebuilding the country would not only take 1 to 2 decades overall, but the high cost even in spite of Marshall Plan funding meant that not everything could be rebuilt. So, for the time being and for many years, the rubble of St. Mary Aldermanbury remained, in its ruined state. Cross the Atlantic in 1945 to the small American town of Fulton in the state of Missouri. At the time, Fulton only had around 9,000 people, and its college was hardly as prestigious as a place like Harvard. But the college in early 1946 decided to offer honorary degrees to U.S. President Harry S. Truman and former British Prime Minister, now opposition leader Winston Churchill. Truman, being from Missouri, was delighted to accept, and encouraged Churchill to also accept, which convinced him to go. With Churchill now being the opposition leader, he saw it as a way to return to international spotlight with a charismatic geopolitical speech. You know, the typical Churchill playbook. Churchill also acknowledged the name Westminster stuck out to him since, British Parliament is in Westminster in London. On March 5, 1946, the two leaders arrived to accept their honorary degrees and to give their speeches. 40,000 people, over 4 times the size of Fulton, gathered to hear Churchill speak. You have to imagine being in small-town or rural Missouri, the opportunity to see such a major foreign figure you heard on wartime radio broadcasts was now in person in your neck of the woods of all places. It wasn't something you could just pass up. In fact, you could even buy pennants for the event like it was a baseball game. Churchill's Sinos of Peace would end up becoming famous for one section in particular where he mentioned the new Soviet bloc across Eastern Europe and describing it as being cut off by an iron curtain.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Aside from the novelty of the speech, this speech in a way was one of the things that informed the American public that the Cold War was on. Remember that while there were always anti-communists who hated the Soviet Union, a lot of the American people were used to the Soviets being an ally that helped take down Nazi Germany. There hasn't been a Berlin blockade yet, no Korean War, no NATO or Warsaw Pact. For the average American, the almost whiplash of the Soviets going from an essential ally to the next great threat was a wake-up call. Towards the 15th anniversary of the speech, Westminster College wanted to build a sort of monument to commemorate the event. But in 1961, the college's president, Robert L.D. Davidson, thought about the ruins of St. Mary Aldermanbury after seeing it in a Life magazine article, hearing that its remains were slated for demolition after 20 years of just sitting there in ruins. Davidson proposed rebuilding the church on Westminster College's campus. You can imagine how random and strange this seemed to the British, and there were worries about how expensive this would be to plan, transport, and rebuild. Churchill, though, loved the idea and endorsed it, which helped convince both the City of London and the Diocese of London to ultimately approve the idea. They were even able to raise $1.5 million to fund the idea. However, Churchill would not live to see the end or even the real beginning of this project, dying on January 24, 1965. Now the question was how to take 600 tons of rubble across the Atlantic and rebuild the church in the same way it originally was. Sure, they'd still need some new material, but they wanted as much of the original as they could get. They ended up taking 7,000 salvageable stones from both the remaining structure and rubble and numbering each of them individually so they know where they belonged. Then they were transported in 1965 by ship across the Atlantic and by train across mainland America until they arrived at Westminster College. The stones were laid out in their numerical order and the building process began. The London Times remarked that this project was one of the most intricate jigsaw puzzles in the history of architecture. Churchill's death early on in the project would add to the public support for it, with Presidents LBJ, Truman, and Eisenhower supporting the project in various ways. Notably, Eisenhower's wife Mamie contributed by helping to stitch one of the kneeling cushions. Eventually, in 1969, the church was finally complete and a commemoration was set on May 7th, which was attended by several American and British dignitaries. At the commemoration, the church was dedicated as a memorial and library for Winston Churchill from then on. By this point, only the foundations and crypt stairway remained from the original 12th century church, so we definitely have a Church of Theseus situation. But now a medieval downtown City of London church was at its new home all the way in a small Missouri college town. In 2009, the library memorial was rebranded as the American National Churchill Museum. Inside, you can see a museum dedicated to both the history of the church and Winston Churchill in the church's basement. Then you can also get guided tours to the church part of the church. I visited there recently and it's definitely worth a visit for the church's beautiful architecture alone, but you can also see random but endearing stuff that you can only find in touristy museums like used Churchill cigars, an autographed Churchill hat, and a monument to the tearing down of the Berlin Wall made from portions of the former wall. There's even an art gallery of paintings that Churchill made in his final years. Overall, if you're passing by, definitely worth a visit. Between this museum and the National World War I Museum in Kansas City, I gotta say, Missouri is really pulling its weight on national museums. I'm Emperor Tiger Star, and I'll see you guys next time.